So here's a wild thought for you. What if the very act of trying to make yourself happy is the thing that is keeping you miserable? So I know this sounds completely backwards, but there's actually a fair amount of science and research that backs up this paradox. So chasing happiness can actually backfire. So, in the video today, I'm going to talk about why this happens and what you can learn from this. And of course, the really big question is what should we all be doing instead? So, over 150 years ago, the philosopher John Stuart Mill observed that the people who were happy were those who were focused on something else, not specifically on their own happiness. Yet we live in a society that pretty much tells us that we should always be trying to be happy. We should always be trying to improve our happiness. And the pursuit of happiness is actually written into the US Declaration of Independence. So, which is it? So, some of the seminal research on this topic was actually done over 20 years ago at the University of California at Santa Barbara when Jonathan Schooler put out a research report which he called The Pursuit and Assessment of Happiness Can Be Self-Defeating. And since then, there has been a lot of research that has basically supported this point. And specifically today, I want to talk about the research of Iris Moss, who's a psychologist and a professor at UC Berkeley. And her research focuses on emotional well being and emotional regulation. And she and a couple of other researchers in 2011 did a study to analyze whether those people who really valued being happy, whether they were actually happier than others or less happy. So, in their research, they gathered a group of women and they had them do a self report questionnaire where they talked about their life satisfaction, their depressive symptoms, and their overall feelings of well being. And then she also asked them to report whether they were feeling a lot of stress in their lives right now or a low level of stress, and whether there were big stressful events that had recently happened in their lives. And what they found was that of the women who were experiencing a low level of stress, the ones who valued happiness more were actually less happy. But in the group of people who were experiencing a high degree of stress, there was no difference in happiness level between those who really valued happiness and those who didn't. So it's interesting, right? That the pursuit of happiness really seems to backfire when life is the best, when stress levels are low. And I think this is because we get that feeling of like, I should be happy. I'm not happy, but I should be because I have all this stuff or all these things are going right. So I should be really happy now. When we're under a lot of stress or things are really difficult in our lives, we don't put that pressure on ourselves. Let me know if that makes sense to you, but it definitely makes sense to me. So, specifically in that low stress group, the people who put the highest value on being happy had more depressive symptoms, had lower satisfaction with their lives, and overall a lower sense of well being. So, Iris and her research team decided to follow up that study with another one because that study showed a correlation between how you value happiness and stress and whether you're happy, but it didn't show causation. It didn't show that they were less happy because they valued the happiness more. So, they put together a research study where they took two groups of people and one group, they had them read an article about how important happiness was for you. And the other group read an article that was neutral. And then they took people from each group, showed some of them a happy movie, and showed some of them a sad movie. So for the people watching the sad movie, there was no significant difference in how sad they felt or how they felt watching the sad movie. But there was a big difference in those people watching the happy movie and the ones who had been primed to value the happiness, read something that told them how important it was. They reported being less happy than the group who just read a neutral article and watched a happy movie. Okay, so these research reports have been followed up with a number of other reports, But I want to flip to, what does this mean for you? And as I say that, I'm thinking like it's sort of a hard thing to stop valuing happiness. I know it's hard for me. We're so geared towards thinking, what do I need to do to feel happier? Why don't I feel happier now? What would make me feel happier? Given everything that's good, I should be happier, right? So then that leads to all that self criticism that we've talked about on this channel and over makes us feel bad about ourselves. So, what can we take away from this? So, the researchers who study this have really come up with sort of two angles on why this happens. One of them I'm going to call the high bar and disappointment angle, and the other is the constant monitoring angle. So, let's start with the high bar and disappointment. If you really value happiness, you can create a very high bar of what that means. And almost all the time, we unfortunately have conflictual feelings. Those moments where we are just purely happy, those are pretty rare. And it's not a sustainable state. But if we think we should be purely happy with no caveats, then we're really likely to be disappointed. And most of you know I was a psychotherapist for 20 years. And I found in working with people, and then I've experienced it myself, that disappointment is one of those emotions we really dislike. It's not talked about as much as, say, grief or anger, but I think disappointment is one of the most difficult emotions. And I would sometimes be amazed at the degree to which people would try to avoid disappointment because they hated it so much. So, with this happiness paradox, if you're always setting the bar really high and then you're disappointed all that time, that's a horrible feeling. And obviously, it cycles in on itself. So, it's actually been very hard for me to read this research without thinking about my grandmother. So, her parents were immigrants. They did not speak much English at all until my grandmother was 5. She spoke their language. So, she went to school not knowing any English. She did not have a easy childhood at all. Her parents were quite poor. And I think she sort of had the view that life was going to be hard. So by the time I knew her, where she was sort of moving into retirement, things were easing. I remember how she would have so much joy and happiness at the simplest things, being able to pick blueberries, having a dessert, dancing. And there's an element where it feels a little bit sad, like I would have wanted her to expect more. I felt like she deserved more, right? But she was quite happy and didn't have any sense of being entitled to an easy life or happiness. So I do try to channel her every now and then. Okay, so the monitoring problem. The monitoring problem is when we are always saying, am I happy now? Why aren't I happy? How happy am I? What is it I'm feeling? Where we're always monitoring our emotional state. Now, obviously, some degree of this is needed, right? But we're talking about balance. So if this is something that you do a lot, it's worth knowing that that element of the constant self monitoring has actually been tied to increased depressive symptoms. Okay, so that's a little more of the underlying theory. All right, so the practical advice on what you can do. I am going to focus on 5 things that you can begin to put in place to help you shift away from that prioritizing of happiness and towards something that maybe will surprise you with happiness. So, number 1 is to accept all of your feelings, including your negative feelings. Because part of the problem is that we try to push away those negative feelings. We don't like to feel anger or guilt or sadness. And we go to a lot of extent to push them away, and it doesn't work. So I know this is very hard and it's very complicated. And I do have a lot of videos on emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. But the main point is to stop focusing on some kind of unattainable ideal. We are almost always going to have a mix of feelings. And sometimes good enough is good enough. And acknowledging and letting yourself feel what you actually feel can actually be really helpful. And not doing this leads us to a lot of guilt and negative self talk, which is my point number two, which is to let go of the self criticism if you're not happy. There's an element in a lot of online stuff which pretty much says, like, well, if you're doing it right, if you put your energies in the right way, in the right area, you're happy. And yeah, sometimes, but sometimes no. We don't have control over everything, and human life can be hard. So I also have videos that go into stopping the negative self-talk and changing these things. I know it needs a lot of work, and I do have an online program, Roadmap to Joy. And in that program, and even if you're not interested in the program, bear with me because I think you'll understand the point I'm making. I really focus on the feeling of joy, not happiness, because I think joy is about those little tiny moments, usually moments when we're mindfully present, usually moments that are pretty simple, like the ones I mentioned that would bring my grandmother joy, right? It's really those small things. It's not always the sort of really big goals. So, I also do have a free webinar called Rewire Your Brain for Joy and Confidence. And in there, I go into some of the scientific research on how we can actually change the focus of our brain away from things that are either problems or triggers and move towards more mindfulness and more joy. And that webinar has a lot of practical tools as well. So, I do know you're gonna need more time and more information to put a lot of this in place, but I just wanna help give you the framework so you know which direction to go in. All right, so stopping that negative self-talk and not making the cycle worse if you're not happy. So recommendation number 3, which comes from a lot of research, is to focus on the activity you're doing, not the feeling you're having. So, in particular, when you are engaging in activities that should make you happy, right? Although we're not going to say that anymore, but really you're going to engage in the activities that you get to choose. Be focused solely on the activity. Now, an example that comes to mind for me is I love to ski. And when you're skiing, you can think of nothing else. You can't really spend time assessing, am I happy? Am I not happy? Although sometimes if you're cold, you can go there. But basically, you have to really, really hyper focus on what you're doing. And it's incredibly relaxing to have my mind and my body focused at the same moment on the same thing. And I think people who engage in music or art feel the same way. So, research has shown that really focusing on those activities rather than on assessing whether you're happy or not surprises you with happiness. Or maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should say surprises you with more contentment and ease, both of which are good things. Okay. So, the number 4 recommendation that also comes from research is to prioritize positivity, not happiness. Now, I want to bring in a caveat with this. But first, let's just talk about, so prioritizing positivity would mean, like, how can I look at this in a positive way? And I do think that practices like gratitude that have been shown overall to help for the most part are a practice of focusing on what is positive in my life. There might be all sorts of things that aren't, but what is positive? And there's even some mindfulness practices of really trying to, like, breathe in the sight of a beautiful flower or the smell of a beautiful flower, just really taking more time to enrich the positive than we usually do. So, focusing on the positive in the way I'm talking about it is both sort of a physical, mindful act of really putting your focus there with all your senses. You can bring in your hearing, sight, smell, really intensify the sensory elements of it. And it's also a cognitive exercise, cognitive being how you think, to try to orient yourself more towards thinking about the positive elements rather than what's missing. Now, my caveat here is that false positivity is not helpful. And if trying to be positive just ends up making you feel more guilty because you really can't do it or more frustrated, skip this one. And maybe there are like little small ways to build it in, like the smell of a cup of tea, but not really sort of trying to change how you think. So that's why I said the sort of a caveat for me on the issue of prioritizing positivity. Although research does show that this does help people overall feel more well being. And then suggestion number 5 is to focus on those things that bring you meaning and purpose rather than those things that will bring you happiness. Now, purpose does not have to be some big, huge purpose. It doesn't have to be an enormous goal. Your purpose could be taking good care of your pet. Your purpose could be to be there when your grandchildren call, right? Like, when I think of my grandmother, how important she was to me. Or your purpose could be to learn more about poetry. And like, as you think these things through, or even as I said that, some people might be like, oh, yeah, that would be really nice. And others are like, whoa, that would not make me happy, right? But knowing what you feel. So, what are the ways, and again, these could be small, to bring more purpose and meaning into your life, bring more connection with others if you can, and shift your focus towards meaning rather than happiness. So the science directly contradicts our culture's obsession with happiness. Constantly engineering your life for peak positive emotion is a fundamentally flawed strategy. So to end today, I just want to read the full quote from John Stuart Mill because it ties into a lot of what we've been saying here. So the full quote is, those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way. All right. Let me know what you think. Please do hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you got value out of this video today. And I really look forward to seeing you next week.